you all for coming. We're also very pleased to have CTSB here tonight recording this program, so thank you for being here as well. It is my absolute, first, business. Please remember to silence your cell phone for the duration of the program, and there will be books available for purchase and signing after the program, courtesy of our friends at the bookstore. That'll be here up front. Now, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Candice Millard. Candice is the author of 4 New York Times bestselling books. Her first book, The River of Doubt, Theodore Roosevelt's Darkest Journey, was a Barnes & Noble Discover Great New Writer Selection and a Book Sense pick, won the William Rockwell Nelson Award, was a finalist for the Quill Awards, and has been published in multiple foreign editions. Destiny of the Republic, A Tale of Madness, Medicine, and the Murder of a President, won the Edgar Award for Best Fact Crime, the Penn Center USA Award for Research Nonfiction, the One Book, One Lincoln Award, the Ohioana Award, and the Kansas Notable Book Award. Netflix recently announced it will adapt the book into a new dramatic series entitled Death by Lightning, starring Matthew McFadden and Michael Shannon. Hero of the Empire, The Boer War, A Daring Escape, and the Making of Winston Churchill was an Indie Next pick, a top 10 critics pick by the New York Times, and was named Amazon's #1 history book of 2016. Candice's most recent book, released in May of 2022, is River of the Gods, Genius, Courage, and Betrayal in the Search for the Source of the Nile. Of that book, the New York Times Book Review wrote, Candice Millard has earned her legions of admirers. She is a graceful writer and a careful researcher, and she knows how to navigate a tangled tale. I'm sure she'll leave here with more admirers tonight as well. Candice is the recipient of the 2017 Bio Award, and her work has appeared in the New York Times Book Review, Washington Post Book World, The Guardian, National Geographic, and Time magazine. She currently is working on her 5th book, which will be set in occupied Belgium and northern France in the early days of World War I. Candice is visiting today from Kansas City, where she lives with her husband and her 3 children. Please join me in welcoming Candice Millard. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for coming. It's such an honor and a great pleasure to be here. You know, I just arrived last night, and I've already completely fallen in love with this place. I mean, I took the most incredible hike with new friends this morning. I had the most amazing tour of the Mount, and I'm coming back. So thank you for making me feel so welcome. In the days leading up to this event, I've been thinking about the work that I do, and I realized that there are a few important lessons that have defined my career, which, if you start in my first days at National Geographic, that would be 28 years. So nearly 3 decades of doing my best to understand some brilliant, fascinating, and often extremely strange people and extraordinary events. So I thought I would share what I've learned from them with you. My first lesson is to go to where the story played out. I'll set the scene. The year is 2000, and I'm in Aksum, Ethiopia, which is in the north of the country on the border with Eritrea. I'm on assignment for National Geographic for the first time, and I'm scared. I'm not scared because I'm in Ethiopia. I loved it there. I'm scared because I'm new at this. It's my big chance, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to mess it up. I had started at National Geographic 4 years earlier, and in that time, I'd worked on stories about everything from dinosaur eggs in Peru to ancient rock art in the Sahara to people in Mongolia who still use eagles to hunt. But I'd never been on assignment until now. And this assignment was to write about the ancient kingdom of Aksum. It was a powerful, wealthy Christian kingdom that began in the 1st century and lasted for centuries. And today, Aksum is a small town. It's devastated by war and drought and famine, but it still claims to have one thing of immeasurable value: the Ark of the Covenant. If you've ever watched Raiders of the Lost Ark, this is what Indiana Jones and the Nazis were searching for. It's a gold-plated wooden trunk said to hold 10 stone slabs in which were engraved the 10 Commandments. It is one of the most famous archaeological objects in the world, and thousands of years ago, it vanished. No one knows where it is, but the Ethiopians say that they do. They say that it is in a small building in Aksum surrounded by a high fence, and only one man is allowed to see it, the keeper of the Ark of the Covenant. When I was there, I obviously wanted to meet the keeper of the Ark of the Covenant. And when I was there, it was a man called Abbe Makonnen. And it's a high honor to be chosen to be the keeper. But when you're given this honor, you enter this small compound and you don't leave for the rest of your life. So I requested to meet him, and days and days went by, and finally I got word that he had agreed to meet with me. And so I went to this compound, went to this gate, and I could hear him coming. He was just barefoot walking down these stone stairs, and he was very small, and he was carrying this golden scepter that was much taller than he was, and he blessed me through the bars of this fence. And I asked him, why can't anyone else see the Ark of the Covenant? And he said, who can look on the face of God? And it was just one of those moments where you think, even at the time, even as it's happening, you think, I'm never going to forget this. While I was in Ethiopia, I also met some incredible children. They were bright, curious, eager to learn, but they went to a very unusual school. It was a school in a monastery on top of a cliff. The cliff was 30 feet high. There's no ladder or climbing holds, just a rope, which you can see behind me in the pictures. And only males are allowed to go to the school, only boys, and only males of any kind of creature are allowed in this monastery. They pull goats up to eat. Only male goats are allowed to go up to this monastery. So obviously I was not allowed to go, but I waited there for hours in this incredible heat, talking to these kids, but it was absolutely worth the wait. Finally, this monk came down to talk to me, and he told me about the history and the traditions in his life there. And you can see in this picture he's reading to me from a history of their monastery. And again, it was just one of these really rare, unforgettable moments that it didn't just improve my article, it enriched my life. So that was my first lesson. If you're going to try to tell a story, you have to go to where it played out, no matter how far away it is, no matter how long ago the story took place. And no matter how much the place and the people may have changed, you will still find something of importance there, and you won't really know what it is until you go. Which brings me to my second lesson, which is find the experts. I also learned this lesson when I was working at National Geographic, but I understood its importance even more clearly and deeply when I began work on my first book, The River of Doubt. This book is about an expedition that Theodore Roosevelt took down an unmapped river in the Amazon in 1914. The expedition took place after Roosevelt tried and failed to regain the presidency, and it's been largely overlooked precisely because of that. And to the extent that it is discussed, it's put in the same category as his hunting trip. So let me tell you, this was no hunting trip. Even by the extraordinary standards of Roosevelt's life, this was a wholly different kind of challenge. This was a serious scientific expedition that became an extraordinary story of survival. It was a contest of man against nature, man against man, and man against himself. During this trip, Roosevelt and his men lost nearly all of their supplies to rapids. One man drowned, another man was murdered, and the rest, including Roosevelt's own son, nearly starved. And survivors emerged from the jungle in rags. They were shadowed and attacked by indigenous tribesmen, and Roosevelt became gravely injured and nearly took his own life in an attempt to save the other men. I did go to the river, which is now called the Rio Roosevelt, but first I went to New York, to the American Museum of Natural History, because I had learned that second lesson, find the experts. When you begin work on a story or a book, whatever it is, you have an idea and you have some knowledge, but most of what you have are questions. So you have to find the people who have the answers. In this case, one of the first questions I had was, who were the people who lived along the banks of the River of Doubt? And why didn't they just massacre Roosevelt and his men when they had the chance and every possible motive? The answer came first from a man named Robert Carnero. Carnero was, at that time, the museum's only expert, only anthropologist focusing on South America. And he was just this incredible personality, and he very generously agreed to meet with me. And so I went to the museum, and he took me to his office, which is in the bowels of the museum. And it was kind of a strange office. It was very narrow, really high ceilings, and it was filled floor to ceiling with books and maps and papers. And so I went there and I explained to him this big question that I had. And I'll never forget, he went, and then he disappeared behind all of these, stacks, teetering piles of books. And I literally saw papers flying up in the air. And then he comes back and he has this map. It's this big map, and he puts it on the table. And it was a map of where all the different peoples were living in the Amazon rainforest. And he said, it's got to be the Cinta Larga. So I had my first clue. After that, I was ready to go to the Amazon. My first stop was Brasilia, where I would meet with another expert. His name was Sidney Pozuelo, and he was the modern-day Candido Rondon. Rondon was Theodore Roosevelt's co-commander on this expedition, and he was one of Brazil's greatest heroes. He was part indigenous. He was born during the War of the Triple Alliance, and he was orphaned when he was just 2 years old. Somehow he worked his way up the ranks of the Brazilian military to become its most legendary commander in charge of the Strategic Telegraph Commission, whose job it was to try to string a telegraph line through the Amazon. By the time Roosevelt met Rondon, Rondon had spent the better part of his life exploring the Brazilian interior and making contact with its most dangerous and isolated tribes. In fact, he was the man who discovered the headwaters of the river that Roosevelt was to descend and named it the Rio da Dúvida, the River of Doubt, because he had no idea where it went. Rondon was passionately devoted to exploring the Amazon, but even more than that, to protecting its indigenous people. In fact, he was so devoted to this goal that he would not let his men fight back, even when they were directly attacked. He famously said, "Die if you must, but never kill." And his men did die. They were constantly attacked, but Rondon would never let them retaliate. It seems incredible to me now that Rondon is not well known, but those who do know him rank him among the greatest explorers who have ever lived. No less a figure than Albert Einstein nominated Rondon for the Nobel Peace Prize in the 1920s. An entire region of the Amazon, an area that's nearly twice the size of England, is named Rondonia in his honor. Sidney Pozuelo, the man I met in Brasilia while doing my research, was, as I said, the modern-day Rondon. Only his job was to find these tribes and not make contact with them, which we finally realized is the best way to protect them. Pozuelo confirmed Carnero's hunch that the tribe that attacked Roosevelt and his men must have been the Cinta Larga. In Portuguese, Cinta Larga means wide belt, and it's in reference to the broad strips of bark that they wrap around their waist to protect themselves during war. The Cinta Larga knew almost nothing of the outside world. In fact, they would have no official contact with the rest of the world until the late 1960s. Roosevelt and his men were the first white men they had ever seen, and they weren't even certain that they were human. In the eyes of the Cinta Larga, they were pale and hairy, they were wearing clothes, and they were riding in boats. And even though the Cinta Larga lived on the banks of a river, they had not yet developed boats. But they were incredibly sophisticated when it came to surviving in the jungle. They could move quickly and quietly, following extremely subtly marked trails. They found game that the expedition not only couldn't find, but couldn't see or hear, and they killed it with simple but very effective weapons. And they routinely engaged in war and were very good at it. They even practiced cannibalism until the late 1970s. They would not eat one of their own, but anything or anyone outside of their tribe was considered to be edible. And Roosevelt and his men, who didn't even look human to them, certainly fell into that category. When I was in the Amazon, I was lucky enough to find and meet with some of the Cinta Larga, who were in many ways the most important experts I interviewed for this book. They weren't easy to find. I had to go to this little town called Cacoal, deep within the Amazon rainforest, where the Brazilian indigenous medical efforts had set up a little medical outpost, and many of them had come in for medical care. And I had a Portuguese translator with me, and I found a group of men. 2 of them in the group had been orphaned as children and had been raised by Brazilians, so they spoke Portuguese, but most of the Cinta Larga speak Tupi-Monde. So we spent the day going back and forth between Tupi-Monde to Portuguese to English and back again. But what I learned, it was something I couldn't have learned anywhere else, and it made everything else make sense. So I knew, again, now who was there, but I still didn't know why they didn't massacre Roosevelt and his men. And what they explained to me was that within the Cinta Larga, there is no chief of the tribe. Essentially, every man is a chief of his own family. And so when they have a big decision to make, so if they are going to move the village or if they're going to go to war, they need a consensus. And in this case, some of them wanted to attack, both out of fear and also because obviously the expedition had extremely valuable supplies, but some of them did not want to attack. They thought it was too dangerous. And so they didn't. But if you think about it for a second, if they had attacked, this expedition only had 22 men. If the Cinta Larga had attacked, they certainly would have killed everyone in the expedition. And the outside world, it would have been this mystery that would be never solved. Theodore Roosevelt would have disappeared down a river in the Amazon and never been seen again. So my third lesson is do your own research. This lesson was particularly important while working on my second book, Destiny of the Republic. This is about the assassination of President James Garfield. At heart, this book isn't about politics or science or even the shooting of a president. It's about an extraordinary drama that unfolded inside the White House over 80 days. What began as a shooting became a bitter struggle over personal power and ambition, and the result was the brutal death of one of our most promising leaders at the hands of his own physicians. Garfield was not, as he has been remembered to be, just another bland, bearded 19th century politician. On the contrary, sorry, I got a little ahead of myself, he was one of the most extraordinary men ever elected president. He was born into desperate poverty. He was our last president born in a log cabin. His father died when he was 2 years old. He didn't have shoes until he was 4. And so his mother and his older brother scrimped and saved $11 to try to send him to college because he was so brilliant. But to make up the rest of his tuition, he was a janitor and a carpenter, his first year of college. By his second year, while he's still a student himself, just a sophomore in college, they made him assistant professor of literature, mathematics, and ancient languages. By the time he was 26, he was a university president. He was an incredible classicist. He knew huge passages of the Aeneid by heart in Latin. And while he was in Congress, he wrote an original proof of the Pythagorean theorem. I'd like to see anybody know any congressman today who could do something like that? I don't think so. To me, though, what is more impressive and more inspirational, and even than Garfield's brilliance, was his decency. You know, I have great admiration for Theodore Roosevelt. He was a firebrand. He was a hero. He was the center of every drama. That's not Garfield. Garfield was the calmest, wisest man in the room. He was a good, kind, honest man who was just trying his best. But he was not only brilliant, he was brave and kind and progressive. He had hid an enslaved man who had run away. He was instrumental in bringing about black suffrage. He was a hero in the Union Army. And when he was inaugurated as President of the United States, Frederick Douglass stood by his side on the Eastern Portico. Although Garfield took his presidency very seriously, he had never had what he called presidential fever. When he went to the Republican convention in the summer of 1880, not only was he not a candidate, he didn't want to be one. He had gone to give a speech nominating another man. And the convention was in this enormous hall in Chicago. There were 15,000 people there. And the favorite to win by far was Ulysses S. Grant, who was trying for a third term as president. And in the midst of the chaos and noise of thousands of people, Garfield got up to speak. And the speech that he gave was so powerful and eloquent and largely extemporaneous that the hall slowly fell silent until you couldn't hear anything but Garfield's voice. Everyone was just riveted. They were spellbound. And at one point he said, "Gentlemen, I ask you, what do we want?" And someone in the crowd shouted, "We want Garfield." And the whole hall just went crazy. And when the balloting began, delegates began casting their ballots for Garfield. And again, he wasn't even a candidate. He stood up and he objected, but the votes kept coming. He couldn't stop what was happening. And a trickle became a stream, then a river, and finally a flood of votes. And before he knew it, despite his earnest objections, he found himself the Republican nominee for President of the United States. Unfortunately for Garfield and the country, just 8 months after he won the election, he was shot in a train station in Washington, D.C. by Charles Guiteau, a mentally ill man who believed that God wanted him to kill the president. Worse, Garfield was not killed by the bullet, which did not hit his spinal cord or any major organs, but by his own doctors, who repeatedly inserted unsterilized fingers and instruments in his back, searching for the bullet and killing the president in the process. I learned a lot of lessons from Garfield's tragic story. Lessons about the danger of arrogance and ignorance, the importance of kindness and courage, decency and hard work. But what I learned as a writer was to always do your own research. This is true for many reasons, but mostly because you never know what you're going to find. I found obviously hundreds of letters and diary entries and newspaper articles, but I also found physical artifacts. At the National Museum of Health and Medicine, I held in my gloved hands a section of Garfield's spine. You can see the red plastic pin where the bullet went through. I also saw the brain of his would-be assassin, Charles Guiteau. After Guiteau was tried and found guilty, he was hanged, but he was very quickly, his body was exhumed, and they took out his brain and they divided it up and they sent it around the country to experts to see if they could see physical signs of insanity. And what they found is that he had syphilis, but that's about it. So they all sent it back in and they put it in a jar, and it's still there in the museum. As is, very strangely, they have pieces of his skeleton. They have like a wrist bone, a femur, in the same drawer as some pieces of the skeleton of John Wilkes Booth. So it's like the assassin's drawer. The fourth lesson I learned applies to research, but also to writing in general. And it is this: look in hidden places. Look where other people might not. When I was searching for an idea for my third book, Hero of the Empire, I turn to one of the most famous people in the history of humankind, a person of whom more books have been written about than anyone but Napoleon and Jesus. When most of us think of Winston Churchill, however, we think of this man. He is virtually a synonym for great leadership. He is a master politician, a savior of his country during World War II, a winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature, and again, one of the most famous human beings in history. But the problem with trying to understand a leader at the height of his career is that we often end up talking about the results of that person's character, not the forces that created it. What I was trying to understand is where that man came from. What gave him the courage, the insight, and the will to become such a towering figure? So instead of writing about this man, I wrote about this man. He was just 24 years old. He had just left the military, the only job he'd ever had, the only job for which he'd been trained. He had no money. He had already tried to run for office and lost. He was like so many other children of privilege then and now who amount to nothing. So how do we connect this young man to the legend he later became? What made the Winston Churchill we all knew? How did he become one of the most powerful and effective leaders mankind has ever produced? An important part of the answer lies, I believe, in an exceptional series of events which I describe in Hero of the Empire. It's a story of what happened when young Winston Churchill went to the Boer War in South Africa in 1899. And he was captured, taken as a prisoner of war, and he escaped by himself. He didn't have a map, he didn't have a compass, he didn't have a weapon, he didn't have food, he couldn't speak the language, and he had an enemy who was humiliated and enraged, scouring every corner of the veldt looking for him. As I researched this book, in a way, I did the same thing that the Boers did. I looked everywhere, from the British Library to Blenheim Palace, from Pretoria, South Africa, to Maputo, Mozambique, for young Churchill. I went to where he was captured in an attack on an armored train. I went to Pretoria, where he was taken as a prisoner of war, and to the building, the Staatsmodel School, where the Boers kept their POWs. I also went to an abandoned coal mine where he hid in a coal mine shaft with white rats for 3 days. And finally to the British consulate in Mozambique, where after 300 miles, he finally found freedom, as well as fame, which he of course quickly used to run for office again, this time winning. I had learned that lesson, look where few others have, and I had found not just Winston Churchill, but his origin story. The final piece of advice that I have to share with you is to try to tell the stories that not only haven't been told, but that deserve to be told, that need to be told. I did that to the extent that I could in my earlier books, but I felt the responsibility to tell an untold story most powerfully when I began my fourth book, River of the Gods. This book is about the search for the source of the Nile, the longest and most storied river in the world, which made possible one of the oldest and richest continuous civilizations in history, bringing life to the Egyptian desert on its more than 4,000-mile-long journey to the Mediterranean Sea. The question was, where did it begin? It was a tantalizing, maddening mystery that for millennia captivated and frustrated everyone from ancient philosophers to Greek historians to Egyptian kings, each determined to find the river source, and with it, the presumed origins of human wisdom and learning. This book is the story of that epic quest, which forced its participants to overcome some of the most forbidding obstacles and hostile conditions in the history of Western exploration. It required traveling thousands of miles into the heart of Africa, which Europeans had never penetrated or understood, and it meant enduring terrifyingly strange, crippling diseases, near starvation, and attack from local peoples prepared to defend their land against uninvited, ultimately dangerous intruders. More than anything else, however, this is a story about the best and the worst of human beings. It's about the heights of human achievement, the enormous limitations of human understanding, and the familiar tragic costs of envy, betrayal, and personal ambition. In the past, my books had one main character. This book has three. Richard Burton, a deeply flawed but undeniably brilliant man. He was an explorer, a writer, a translator, and he spoke more than 25 different languages. He was fascinated with everything, and he tried everything from any kind of drugs to all kinds of sex. In fact, he was the first person to translate the Kama Sutra into English. He was that most terrifying of creature to Victorian Britons, a hedonistic man in a puritanical age. And he was always considered an outsider, a suspicious, dangerous man. In fact, none other than Bram Stoker, who would go on to write Dracula, was obsessed with him. The man riveted my attention, Stoker wrote after meeting Burton. He was dark and forceful and masterful and ruthless. I never saw anyone like him. He is steel. He would go through you like a sword. He was especially fascinated by Burton's teeth, writing that when Burton talked, his canine tooth showed its full length like the gleam of a dagger. So you tell me. Burton's second in command was a man who was as unremarkable as Burton was extraordinary, his complete opposite in nearly every way. John Hanning Speke was everything Britons expected their heroes to be. He was blonde and blue-eyed. He was born into the aristocracy. He was an officer in the British Army. He was puritanical and prim, priding himself on his discipline and judging others harshly if, in his eyes, they fell short. While Burton buried himself in books, Speke devoted himself to hunting, planning to open a natural history museum in his ancestral home. Speke was also deeply, dangerously resentful of his commander, a festering bitterness that remained unspoken for years, building with each offense that Burton unknowingly gave, each achievement or accolade that Burton received and Speke did not. For years, Speke simmered with barely contained anger and envy until finally it boiled over, leaving Burton shocked and bewildered, and in the end, destroying them both. The man I most want to tell you about, however, and the man who made me want to write this book, is someone who has been largely forgotten, even though he was the most important member of Burton's expedition and arguably the most accomplished guide in the history of African exploration, Sidi Mubarak Bombay. Kidnapped from his village in East Africa when he was just a child, Bombay had been sold for cloth in Zanzibar, and then forced onto a ship traveling to India, where he had been enslaved for some 20 years. Finally freed when the man who owned him died, he had made his way back to the continent of his birth, where he met Burton and Speke. Bombay quickly became the heart and in many ways the hero of Burton's expedition. He was the linchpin that kept them connected, the caravan leader, the porter, the mediator, the nurse. Even after losing everything he knew and loved and being enslaved for decades, Bombay somehow emerged from that staggering tragedy not with bitterness, but with kindness. He was soft-hearted, patient, hardworking, generous to a fault. He would also go on to achieve what Burton and Speke would never be able to do, even with all of their resources, advantages, and ambition. Not only did he travel with Burton and Speke to Lake Tanganyika, which Burton had hoped was the source of the Nile, but he was with Speke when, in a brutal twist of fate, he, and not Burton, became the first European to reach the Nyanza, the largest lake in Africa and the actual source of the White Nile, which Speke would name for his own queen, Victoria. Then, a year later, Bombay returned to the Nyanza with Speke and James Grant. Then, he helped Henry Morton Stanley find David Livingstone. You know Dr. Livingstone, I presume? That was Bombay. And then, with Verney Leavitt Cameron, Bombay became the first to cross the entire continent of Africa, from east to west, sea to sea. I worked at National Geographic for 6 years. I was steeped in stories of exploration in Africa, and I had never even heard Bombay's name. And of course, Bombay is just one of countless explorers who have been forgotten and whose stories deserve to be told. If you want to be a writer, that's your job. It's to tell untold stories or rarely told stories, to go where the story played out, to find the experts, to do your own research, to look in hidden places, and to be honest with your readers. You have to have one eye on history and the other on future generations who deserve to know the truth. History is rarely pretty, but it is always fascinating, and it always has something to teach us if we are only willing to listen. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions if there are any.
I've only listened to one of your books, and I find you both a beautiful writer.
Thank you.
Amazing research.
Thank you.
And can you go back in your life to when you first started writing, what you enjoyed about it, and then how you built your research?
Yeah, I mean, like is true, I'm sure, for every writer and actually most people, it started in a library. I grew up in a small, largely blue-collar town in Ohio, and we had this, I was telling Maria today, we had this really great little library that my parents were big readers, and we would walk there. I had 3 sisters. We would walk there every weekend, grab our books, and it would just launch us into everything. And I'll tell you the moment that really changed things for me, and I don't know if this directly answers your question, but when I was probably 12 years old, we went to that library, and they had this vertical revolving rack with books in it, and there were books that they were giving away. So there was this little handwritten sign that said free on top, and I went up, and the books were books for adults, so I didn't really know any of them. But I saw one that I liked. I liked the cover. I pulled it off, and it was called I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings. And I had never heard of that book. I had never heard of Maya Angelou, but I just, I liked the cover. And so I started walking home, and I can still remember it, and I still have my copy of that book because it really did change things, because I started reading it. And obviously there was a lot that I didn't understand in it, and a lot that sort of frightened me. But for the first time, I realized that books could be something more than educational or entertainment. I realized that they could really transport you. And I realized, I think, for the first time what literature was. And that really stayed with me. And so I just thought, whatever I do, I want to do something where I get to read a lot. And I didn't know for a long time if I could write. That was a whole journey in itself, but that's where it began. So thank you to libraries. Yes.
I found it extremely sad that Garfield was so haunted that he hadn't been president long enough to accomplish anything.
Mm-hmm.
They knew he was dying, and he knew he was dying.
Yeah. Right.
He felt his presidency, nobody would even remember who he was.
Right. And it wasn't just him. I mean, I don't think he was worried about being remembered. And again, he hadn't been trying to be president, but he thought, as long as I'm president, maybe I can do something good. And obviously he was extremely interested in education, which had been his own salvation. He was extremely interested in rights for freedmen. So there were a lot of changes that I think maybe would have happened earlier in this country had he lived. But I will say, they often, depending on how you look at a situation, there is a silver lining. And for this, I mean, it brought about the end of the spoils system as it was at that time, at least. Chester Arthur, no one thought, I mean, people were horrified at the thought of Chester Arthur being president. And he tried, I think, to become the kind of president that Garfield would have been had he lived. And he was never a great president, but he at least much better than he would have been with that kind of inspiration. And obviously, people started sterilizing their fingers and instruments. I mean, Dr. Bliss, as soon as the autopsy report came out, people understood that the president didn't have to die, and they understood why he did. And antisepsis was adopted, throughout the country and saving many, many lives and limbs.
Well, who is the main character of your new book?
Should I talk about? Do you want me to talk about my new book now? Okay. Thanks for asking. So it's set in the early days of World War I in occupied Belgium and northern France. And I'm very excited because I've tried for many years to write about a woman, and it's challenging with narrative nonfiction because you need a story where not only do you have writings from the people you're writing about, but you need other people at the time to have been paying attention and to have written it down. And that, Winston Churchill was 24 years old, but everybody was paying attention to him and writing, so I have from many, many different perspectives. But this is a story about specifically 3 women. One was a British nurse who was in Brussels. One was a French princess just over the border in France, and one was a French school teacher. And independently, after the Germans occupied and they start having these horrible battles, they start helping and hiding young Allied soldiers who are left behind during after battles. So either they're horribly injured or they're just left behind in the chaos of battle. And so they start hiding them because if the Germans find them, they'll kill them. And they start to they hear about each other, and they work together, and a network slowly forms, and dozens of people helping to then help these people escape through the border with the Netherlands. And it's just this incredible story of unbelievable courage until they're all betrayed by a Frenchman. And you'll have to read the book to find out what happened. Yeah.
So have you ever gone down a road thinking that you had a story, but it turned out there wasn't enough there?
Yes, I was just saying earlier today that's happened several times because the most important part of the process is the idea. And so you have to make sure, first of all, that you yourself are just absolutely fascinated with it because, it takes me 5-6 years. And you obviously have really compelling characters and minor characters and a lot of action, but you also have to have mountains and mountains of primary source material. Diaries, letters, newspaper articles, so much that you think that you'll never get through them all. And so I'll tell you one story that really broke my heart, and I still may tell, so nobody steal it, all right? It's about Benjamin Franklin, and it's about the only house still standing where he lived. And it's in London, and it's near the Thames, and it had just been abandoned. It was falling apart. There were squatters living in it. So this organization called the Friends of Benjamin Franklin bought it, and they were renovating it. And they had these men in the basement. They were digging, and this man found a bone, and then he found another bone and another bone. And he ended up finding 1,200 human bones in this basement. So they called the police, and the police are like, these are very old bones. You need a forensic anthropologist. And these bones dated to exactly the time when Benjamin Franklin lived in this house for 17 years. So you think, founding father serial murderer? What's going on? So what happened was that he had gone to England to try to stop the revolution. He was a loyalist at the time, and he had rented 2 floors of this 4-story townhome from a widow and her daughter who was named Polly. And Polly married a young man named Matthew Hewson, who was a doctor and anatomist at a time when it was illegal to perform autopsies. So they literally had a tunnel running from the Thames where they would buy bodies from these resurrection men and bring them in. There was just over their garden wall was a gallows where people could, you could be hanged for any of 200 different, you read somebody else's mail, you're going to be hanged. And so they would make deals with these people because their families would have to pay for their hanging. And so they would say, look, I'll give you a new suit of clothes for your hanging, and I'll pay the expenses if I can have your body afterwards. And so he was performing these autopsies in this basement. And this is Benjamin Franklin. He's obviously this incredible scientist. He was bringing young men from the United States. They were from the colonies. There were no medical schools here at that time. He was bringing them to England to study with Matthew Houston. Matthew became like a son to him. He kind of had abandoned his family here. And then in 1775, Matthew Houston cuts himself during an autopsy and dies from septicemia. And at the same time, Franklin realizes that he's on the wrong side. He's kicked out of England. He has to go back. He's devastated. And Polly moved with him. She was pregnant with her third child. And she moved with him to Philadelphia. And she raised her children there. And many of them grew up to be doctors. Several of them grew up to be doctors. And I was able to trace the family. And I got in touch with them and I said, please tell me that you have a diary or something where I can prove that Benjamin Franklin was in this basement. And they don't have it. So, I mean, but it was the Age of Enlightenment. I mean, he was friends with Erasmus Darwin. I mean, it's a rich, rich, rich story. So maybe someday, but yeah, I spent a year working on that. Yeah.
Have you given any thought to the subject matter of your next book?
I'm sorry, the subject of my next book? Yes, yeah, it's about World War I, the early days of World War I. Yeah, that's right. Yep, that's it. Yeah.
When you were at the Mount, you probably picked up that Edith Wharton, who was in France during World War I, organizing Red Cross work. Okay.
Yes, yeah, no, I was very, very interested in that. I took a bunch of pictures and yeah.
I just have two quick questions. With your knowledge on the Nile and how it really is the lifeblood, the core of Egypt, there's a dam being built, and I understand there are forces massing in Ethiopia. Ethiopia is raising a large army. And I was interested in your thoughts on that. And just quickly, a new book is out looking at the mothers of TR.
Oh, right, The Loves of Theodore Roosevelt. Yes.
Your thoughts on the impact of the mothers and their character?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I don't know much about modern day Ethiopian politics, and it's been, a couple of years since I was there, so yeah, I probably shouldn't comment on that because, it's interesting and it's their land, and they certainly have the right to protect it. So, but more than that, I don't really know. But The Loves of Theodore Roosevelt, I actually know Ed O'Keefe. I did an event with him in Kansas City, and I think it's a great book. I would recommend everyone read it because he had these incredibly strong women in his life, his mother and his sisters and his wife and his daughters, and especially his sister Bammy. She especially is just a fascinating character because she for the first couple of years of her life, she raised his daughter Alice, his oldest daughter. His first wife died on the same night of his mother. The famous X in his diary where he says, "The light has gone out of my life," and that's when he went to the Dakota Territories and left behind his daughter, and Bammy raised her. And then she also largely raised Eleanor Roosevelt, whose father, Elliot, Theodore's brother, died an alcoholic and morphine addict. So she was just this incredibly influential character in the lives of a lot of important people. And she certainly, I think, had she lived in a different time, she would have been a person of prominence, and she likely, would have been president of the United States instead of her brother. Yeah.
Going back to Teddy Roosevelt, I'll try to keep it to just a couple of questions. So I read your book, big fan.
Thank
It's
you.
so interesting about sort of stamina in him.
Mm-hmm.
Sickly when he's young.
Right.
That big thing. And so if you could talk about stamina and sort of testing yourself,
Uh-huh.
and then maybe the second, I feel like he's overcompensating. And it'd be interesting to hear you maybe doing the psychology. What's he overcompensating?
No, it's very true, and I think a lot of it made him the man he was. So as you say, so he was a very sickly child. He was a horrible asthmatic. His parents tried everything. They would, race him through the streets in carriages at night. They made him smoke cigars. They thought that was a good idea. And then finally his father said to him, he was like, you had the mind, you need to make your body. And he famously said, I will make my body. And so then he pushed himself, and he was a boxer, and he was a swimmer, and just made himself stronger and stronger. But then as he got older, he used difficult, challenging, and even better, dangerous adventures and challenges to help him get over loss and grief and failure. So when his father died, and he loved his father and he admired his father, and so his father died when he was in college, and he went to the backwoods of Maine, and he pushed himself so hard that a guide was like, watch out for Roosevelt, he'll kill himself before he even says he's tired. And then when he lost his first wife and his mother on the same night, again, he goes to the Dakota territories. He's this crazy cowboy. He's, him personally tracking down thieves and things. And then when his presidency ended, so obviously he first becomes president when McKinley is assassinated, so he didn't have a full term. He wins again, and he says, I'm not going to run again. And he's a very young man still, and his family knows this is a bad idea. So he finishes his term, he goes to Africa, Taft becomes president, and he hates everything. And he basically anointed Taft, but then he's unhappy with everything Taft was doing. So that was Africa. He was trying to forget, but he couldn't, right? So he comes back, and then he runs again against Taft. The Republicans were like, look, we want you to run again, but can you just wait? We have an incumbent. Can you just wait? And being Theodore Roosevelt, no, I can't wait. So he splits the Republican Party, puts a Democrat in the White House for the first time in 16 years. So he's a pariah for the first time in his life, and he's also not used to losing. So that's when he goes to the River of Doubt. So again, it was his way of dealing with all the trauma that we all experience, but his way was to put himself in these deadly situations. Yeah.
If you write some books today about some people, who would it be?
That's interesting. I mean, I won't write about people today. First of all, I don't want their opinion on what I'm writing, and I don't want immediate family's opinions. And I love history, and also, I mean, I was just talking to my son about that. He loves history. He loves ancient history, and he's like, why don't you write about it? And I said, that's interesting, but I love the Victorian, Edwardian era because they kept diaries, because they wrote letters, and not just short things. I mean, Theodore Roosevelt, he was 60 years old when he died, and he packed so much into his life, but at the same time, he was writing these long, thoughtful, funny, interesting letters to his kids and his family, and it's just, I have no idea how he did it, but it's fascinating. It's just rich material to work with. So I think I'm going to kind of stick with my sweet spot. But anyway, I think maybe we can talk later. Or can I take one more? Okay. All right. One more.
So the question came up about Winston Churchill's mother.
Oh, right.
Could you comment on the role she played in getting him out or not getting him out of South Africa?
Yeah, so as I'm sure you all know, his mother was American. I always say that was the kind of the pushy part of Winston Churchill, and he adored her, but he would always say that he adored her from a distance, because she, I won't go into all of it, but as a mother, it always just kind of broke my heart to read his letters to them from boarding school, because his father was always too busy and extremely harsh with him. His father was this very famous politician, and his mother was, this incredibly beautiful, charismatic socialite, and so she was too busy with parties and things. But as he became older, he became more interesting to her, and he realized that he could use her because there were all these powerful men, especially in the military, who were in love with her, and so she could say, hey, can you give my son an appointment? And they would. And so he would always say, hey, Mom, do this for me, and she would, because he was now interesting. So he goes to South Africa, and they don't know. It's obviously a different time. They They hear that he's been captured. They hear that he's a POW. They hear that he's escaped, and that's it. And nobody knows. And they know that if the Boers find him, that they will kill him. And there's really nothing that they can do. That he had this. It was his first love of his life. This woman named Pamela Plowden, and she and Churchill's mother would commiserate and things. But there's even in this point in her life. And by the way, when he went to South Africa, he found out that she was going to marry a man who was 2 weeks older than he was. Yeah, and she did marry. And you'll be shocked to know it didn't last. It didn't work out. Anyway, she was a fascinating character. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.